In the previous video, discussed about what functions as a scope was. So today we are going to discuss about what blocks as a scope is. So let's start now. Until ECMAScript.6, we had only functions as a scope, and functions as a scope was made possible with the help of var identifier. And when we use var identifier to declare a variable, the scope of the variable was limited to the function we declared the variable in. But with the release of ECMAScript.6, blocks as a scope was made possible, and that was made possible with the help of let identifier. So when we declare a variable with the help of let identifier, using let identifier, it limits the scope of the variable within that block, and when we try to reference the variable out of the block, out of the scope of the block where the variable is declared, we get a reference error. Now let's move into an example. So here we have an example with a variable food declared in a global scope and with a var identifier, and we have an if block, and the if block is executed when the expression here is true. Since the value of foo is always true, hence the if block is always executed. So within the if block we have declared a variable bar, and we have declared this variable bar using var identifier, which means that the variable bar is scoped within a function where the variable bar is declared. But since we have no function here enclosing enclosing these variables, so the variable bar is declared in a global scope, and we are assigning the value foo times 2 to the variable bar. Since the value of foo is true, which is a boolean operator, the boolean value, the value of foo is coerced to number when we perform on a numerical operation, because in JavaScript, when a boolean value is operated with a number, the boolean value gets coerced to number, and the boolean value 2 is coerced to value 1, and the boolean value false gets coerced to 2 0. So when we perform foo times 2, we get the result 1 times 2, which is equal to 2. So the value of 2 is assigned to the variable bars, and when we console log bar within the block, we get the result 2. And since the variable bar is not limited within the scope, hence when we try to console log the variable bar out of the block, we get the result 2. But what happens when we use the identifier let to declare the variable bar? Well, when we declare the variable bar using the identifier let, the scope of the variable bar is only limited within the if block. Hence, we can only get the value of bar within when we try to access the variable bar within the block where the variable bar is declared. And when we try to access the variable bar out of the scope where the bar is declared, we get a reference error like this. So now let's check this out by executing this code. So here we have the same example here, and I have used this string to recognize if the value is from within the block or out of the block. Now let's run this code and see what happens, what is the result. So yeah, here we get the result 2 from within the block and also 2 from out of the block, since we have used the identifier var to declare the variable bar. What happens when we use identifier let? Let's check this out. and let us see the result. So yeah, here we get the value 2 from within the block, but we get a reference error. We are getting a reference error saying that bar is not defined from, and we are getting this reference error from here. We are getting this reference error from here, so which means that the variable bar is not is only recognized within this scope and is not recognized out of this scope. We saw about let as an identifier to declare a variable, and now let us look about const. So const was also introduced in ECMAScript 6, and when we declare a variable using the const identifier, what we actually do is we actually scope the variable within the block where we declare the variable, and also the variable is declared with a constant value, which means that the value of the variable cannot be changed after the initialization, and the initialization is done at the time of declaring the variable. And if we try to change the value of the constant variable, then we get the type error. So let's look into an example now. So here we have a variable food declared in a global scope, and a block, if block, which is executed when the expression here is true, which always is. And within this if block we have a variable a declared in the global scope using a var identifier, and we have a variable b, and this variable is declared in the block scope using const. So the variable b is declared in const block scope, and we have initialized the value of b to 3, which means that when we try to change the value of b afterwards, then we get an error, since the variable b is a constant variable and we are not allowed to change the value of b. And also when we try to access the value of b out of the scope, out of the block where we have declared the variable b, we get a reference error, because using a const identifier to declare a variable, it limits the scope of the variable inside this block only. So let's now check this out by executing this code. So here the same example here we have, and within the if block we have declared the variable b with a value constant using const identifier. So when we try to change the value of b here, we get an error, and the error is something like this. It says it is a type error which says that assignment to constant variable, which means that we are trying to assign to a constant variable, and which is not allowed by JavaScript. And again, when we try to console log the value of b out of the scope of foo where it is declared, we get an error, and it says reference error, b is not defined, because the variable b, which was declared using const identifier, is only limited within the scope of this block, this if block. Hence what we conclude is that the identifier let and const limits the scope of the variable within the block where it is declared, and the identifier const have one more feature, and which is that it declares the variable with a constant value, which means that the value of the variable cannot be changed